Now, we know that Donald Trump has reached out to Vladimir Putin to say, let's meet Vladimir and discuss Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin, or rather the Kremlin, has responded and said a meeting is being planned for, as soon as he gets into the White House. That is Trump, not Putin. But we don't know when, whether it's going to be at the beginning of February or, March. We don't know. But the point is that the two of them will discuss Ukraine. And you kind of wonder whether Ukraine, or to what extent Ukraine will be allowed to participate in talks about its own future, about its own sovereignty, about its own country. I would have thought that in order to, avoid a kind of Versailles moment where the victorious allies talked about Germany, then punished it, and we knew the consequences of that, it would be very good, essential, in fact, for Ukraine to be involved in this somehow as well. So let's talk to Chris Henmeyer. He's a humanitarian worker who's founder of the charity In the Trenches, which provides equipment, clothing and food to military units on the front line in Ukraine. Good morning, Chris.
Matt, nice to be here.
So you have a lot of contact with people who've actually been fighting this war for the last almost 3 years. How do they feel about the impending reality of Donald Trump and the White House talking to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think in general, people feel slightly more sanguine about the arrival of Trump in the White House than they did over the last 2 years of the Biden administration, simply because of the very slow pace of arms and funding that Washington delivered to Kyiv. So in a sense, they're simply excited that something new is happening that might break the deadlock. Now, of course, that could turn out very badly as well. It's unclear at this point what Trump actually plans, and his many advisors have floated ideas, but we don't, in fact, know, and we won't know probably for several weeks.
But it is possible that what he comes up with is not nearly as disastrous as many people had predicted a year ago. I mean, I'm saying it's possible. It is not by any means probable or inevitable.
It is indeed possible. I think, if we're looking at likelihoods, probably what will happen is that there will continue to be a large flow of arms and other support to Ukraine to give them the strongest possible negotiating position. And then perhaps negotiations will begin, and they will be long, drawn out, very slow and painful affairs, but probably will begin sometime in the middle of this year.
And of course, Biden has been ramping up the dispatch of military equipment to the Ukraine. Many would argue, perhaps you yourself, belatedly, but he's been doing it in the last few months, hasn't he, before leaving office?
Well, he has, but of course he's left money on the table, which is really disgraceful, in my opinion. That money should have been moved out the door months ago, and there were enough people telling him that had to happen, and yet the administration continues to be quite slow.
I mean, I think the Biden administration would say that one of its successes on the foreign policy front has been the way that it handled the Ukraine war. What would you say to that claim?
I would say they're wrong. The Biden administration has done just enough to keep Ukraine in the fight, but not enough to allow them to win or to place them in a strong negotiating position. I'm unclear why that is. It's an administration rife with foreign policy experts, at least self-proclaimed ones. But that's the situation we have now, and it's not an enviable hand that the Ukrainians are playing.
I guess they would say the reason why they've practiced this caution is because they're afraid of baiting the Russian bear too much and igniting some kind of global, possibly nuclear conflict.
Yes, that's indeed what they would say, and I'm not sure there's any evidence to support that. In fact, many have said that the Chinese have very specifically leaned on Putin and told him, "Don't you dare press any kind of nuclear button." So, this is all pretty much speculation.
And if that's the case, if the Biden administration has been too soft on Russia and too cautious with Ukraine because of these nuclear fears that, as you and many others have said, are unfounded, is there anything that suggests that Trump will be tougher on them, or tougher on the Russians?
Well, with Trump, everything is personal. It all depends upon whether he feels that he's been accorded sufficient respect. And I'm quite happy to see the Russians have actually treated him somewhat dismissively since he was elected. There have been a number of occasions where they had an opportunity to reach out and sort of curry favor with him. They've avoided doing so. All they've said so far is, yes, there are talks underway to begin a summit with Trump and Putin. But we have nothing more than that. And they've been quite clear, the Russians that is, that their initial requirements of this war remain unchanged. The absurd notion that Kyiv is run by neo-Nazis and that they must be dethroned, the notion that huge chunks of Ukraine must remain under Russian control, in fact, more territory than they control now. that NATO basically disarm, demilitarize, and not join NATO. None of these are positions that can be acceptable to the Ukrainians, and I don't think to the Americans either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Also, I don't think Trump wants to be associated with a kind of Afghanistan-style, departure, hasty retreat, which really damaged the reputation of the current administration, and also perhaps prepared the ground for Putin to think, well, if they're not going to protect Afghanistan, I might as well walk into Ukraine. Just finally, Chris, on the front line, what do the men and women fighting this war feel? Are they so tired now that they are desperate for some kind of deal, even if it involves giving up some territory, or would they feel that that is a sacrifice wasted?
I think it depends on your audience. Men and women on the front line do not want to give up territory, not a square meter. Generally speaking, the Ukrainian population is more open to giving up some territory than they would have been a year or 2 years ago. But I don't think they're exhausted to the point that they're ready to collapse neither the society nor the armed forces. And let's remember, the Russian forces are also deeply, deeply wounded. They've been bleeding white, over 1,000 troops per day lost, either killed, missing, or injured. So it's not as if Russia has huge numbers of people to throw into this fight without going for a general mobilization, which Putin has avoided doing so far.
Good point. Chris Heinemeyer, thank you very much indeed for joining us. He's a humanitarian worker who also is the founder of the charity In the Trenches.